Okay, welcome back to our final discussion about isometric drawings for our first day. What we're looking at here is probably the most complicated thing about isometric drawing, and that's understanding that round things, circles, like this hole going through this block, well, circular things don't remain circular when we look at them in isometric. We're going to have to change the shape because the angle gives the circle a different shape or a different form when we look directly at it. So what I've got here is I've got the 3 by 3 by 3 cube that we've been making, and I want to show you how to set up round or circular features. So this would be for holes. This would also be for cylindrical items, and not too tough to set up. I've got my top, front, and right faces here, and what I need to do is I need to set up some center lines on them. So I have a center line layer, and I'll find my midpoints, and I will draw lines through the midpoints. And I'm going to do this on the 3 faces. What I've got is basically a center mark on the front face here, and on the top face here, and on the right side face here. Now, if you were to draw a circle to represent a hole, you'd see right away something looks weird. So while the cube appears to be in isometric, the circle doesn't. And if we looked at our little 3D model here, we see that the shape is more elliptical, and that's what we need to create. We need to create an ellipse because this just looks goofy. So we'll get rid of our circle, and we're going to take a look at the ellipse command. Now the ellipse command has 3 options. One is to make a center ellipse, one is to make an axis end ellipse, and then elliptical arc. And what we're interested in is an axis end ellipse. Now if you've never made one of these, axis end ellipse is basically a click and a click. That defines the major axis, and then your second click defines the minor axis. But you can see here that using the tool this way gives you a lot of variety. I can have a very skinny ellipse or a very fat ellipse. So how do we know which ellipse is the correct ellipse so that it looks just like that when we're drawing an isometric? Well, to do that, we're going to have to turn on a tool we haven't used yet. Okay, so down on your status bar, if all your tools are visible, you should see one over here called Isodraft. We're going to turn that on. And then right away something weird's going to happen. Take a look at my cursor. And do you see how my cursor is now an X instead of a T? In fact, my cursor looks like it's aligned with that center mark on the top plane. Now if I go back into there, I can say I want to align it to the left isoplane. And now take a look at my cursor. Now it's lined up with the center mark on that front face. And then the other option would be to align it to the right isoplane. So now it's lined up with the right face. So what we want to do is we want to make sure, if we want to drill a hole through the top of this block, that our cursor matches the orientation of those center marks. So I'm going to set this for isoplane top. And if you want to hit the F5 key, F5 will cycle you through the different planes while this tool is on. And you see it's all lined up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click over on the axis end ellipse. And now this will only work when you have the isometric drafting tool on. It says what kind of ellipse do you want, and you're not going to do what we just did where you gave it 2 endpoints for the major axis and then 1 endpoint for the minor axis. You're going to say, hey, I want an iso circle. I need an isometric circle. So I'll click iso circle, and then right away it wants to know a center point. And then as you're pulling it out, take a look. See how the shape does not change? In fact, we're going to give it a size. If I say give me a 1-inch radius, well, now that circle is set up with a 1-inch radius in isometric. It matches perfectly what we would get if we were to actually model this thing, or just take a block of wood and drill a hole through it. Okay, so in order to draw circles in isometric, we have to have the isoplane turned on with our Isodraft tool. When it's time to drill a hole through the front, we're going to use the same ellipse tool. But take a look. If we were to pick Isometric Circle and click there, and then type 1 for our radius, that doesn't look right, does it? In fact, it should look wrong to you. If we take a look, we've got another model to look at here. See, on this model, do we see how the ellipse is not going horizontal long ways left to right? It's actually pointing up to the left. So this is what we should be looking for, and that's not what I see using the tool like I just did. So why did it do that? Why did it make that ugly looking ellipse? Well, because the cursor isn't oriented to match the center mark. So I'm going to go down and I'll hit F5 until I've lined up my cursor with the center mark for that left isoplane. Now if I go in and I do an axis and ellipse and I say give me an iso circle here, and I type in 1 for the radius, well, now it gives me that size that I want. We'll take a look at the what should the right hand side look like, and here it is. Right hand side ought to look like that, with the long axis of the ellipse pointing up to the right. So I'll have to go in and hit F5 until my isoplane is lined up with the right face, and then I'll go back to my axis and ellipse. I'll specify I want an iso circle. I'll click at the intersection and I'll type in 1 for my radius. And this is how we're going to create some shapes in isometric when we have to work with round things like holes and cylinders. Now, through the magic of special effects, I just threw a few more things up on the screen. Take a look closely at this figure here. So it's isometric. It's a thin piece of material. There's a hole going through it. Does it look complete to you? See, if we looked at that, we might think, well, it looks pretty good, but something seems to be missing. There's something wrong about it. And it's true. You know, we should see a little curvature back here because this hole is only going through that much material. It's kind of thin. Over here, if I drilled a hole in the top, well, you wouldn't see the bottom of that hole, right? We don't see the back side of those holes, but let's just say we were to have some control over that, and we could shrink it. Do you see how you can see the back edge of that hole there because it's not that thick? So let's go back to our practice. How do I create the back edge of the hole without guessing, right? Because that's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to avoid guessing. And it's really simple. All you need to do is figure out how thick the material is. And our material is that thick. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this circle from the center point there at 30 degrees back to the end of this little line, which represents how thick the material is. All right, and now what do I see? Well, now I see a curve back there, and with a little bit of creative trimming, I can get rid of the parts on that curve that I don't need. And now we're accurately representing the hole, the back edge of the hole, and the thickness of the material. If I was going to make something that was a solid cylinder instead of a cutout cylinder, right, because the hole is like a cutout cylinder, a negative cylinder. If I wanted to make a positive cylinder, we'll set our polar for 30. We'll go back as far as we need to go back, however many inches. I made that 5 inches back. I'll copy from the front to the back. And I'll draw some line work. Let's see, maybe setting up our tangent snap and turning off some of these other ones that are just going to get in the way. So line work, tangent out here. Now tangent's not seeming to work. What's going on? Well, tangent works for circles, and this is an ellipse. So what we might want to set or try instead of tangent, is quadrant. And if we go from the quadrant of that ellipse to the quadrant of that ellipse, what we'll find is it's going to do the same thing. It's going to create a line that forms the natural tangent connection between the face up here and the face back there. And then a little bit of trimming. And that takes care of our cylinder that's pointed this way. If our cylinder was standing straight up, we'll start with a ellipse that's pointing left to right on that top isoplane. Copy it straight up as far as you want it, or straight down as far as you want it. Draw some lines from the quadrants. And then trim out the parts you don't need. And this guy here, well, obviously no different than the one on the other side, right? So give me the intersection. Give me an inch back. And we'll just copy our isometric ellipse from there to here. Get rid of extra stuff we don't need, and then draw our lines to create those tangencies between the quadrants. Okay, so this is really the most difficult thing you'll ever have to do in isometric, working with circles. We see that circles, although they are round when we drill the hole, they're not going to look very round when we pop those things into an isometric orientation. They'll become ellipses. If we take a look over in the Coursepack, we see there's a section on isometric circles in the B12 Coursepack. This is kind of what we were just drawing a little bit earlier, and we see that the long axis of the ellipse lines up with the long axis of the diamond for the top. The long axis of the ellipse lines up with the long axis of the diamond in the front, and the long axis of the ellipse lines up with the long axis of the diamond in the right side. Here's our 3 different holes in 3 different orientations. It's the same exact ellipse, just pointing in different directions. Okay, we see the same thing in our B12 Coursepack on page 143. Here's our axis end ellipse, and of course we pick the ISO circle option in order to create those.